Good afternoon. I'm Lynn Ward, President and CEO of the Waterbury Regional Chamber, and I'd like to welcome you this afternoon to our virtual meeting with Senator Chris Murphy. We're so pleased to have the Senator with us today to address our Chamber members' concerns and thoughts. We're so appreciative of his time. And as we begin this afternoon, you'll see on your screen that Carmody, Torrance, Sandeck, and Hennessy is the sponsor of today's virtual event for the Waterbury Regional Chamber. And we are so appreciative of Carmody and Torrance, Sandeck, and Hennessy, who's been a member of our chamber for many decades. Their attorneys are very supportive of our efforts, and they have been helping us so much with our COVID response and information to all of our businesses in our region. So special thank you to our friends at Carmody, Torrance, Sandeck, and Hennessy. I'd like to now introduce to you our chairman of the board of directors for the Waterbury Regional Chamber. He is an attorney with the Flood Law Firm. Don McPartland has been a leader in our organization for many years, and we are privileged to have him as our chairman of the board. Don, thanks so much for being with us today and for moderating our discussion with the senator.
Well, thank you, Lynn, and it's such a privilege to do this as well. I've known Senator Murphy for many years now. I've had the privilege of working with him on a number of different projects. But Senator, thank you so much for joining us during this very busy time in Washington and with this country. And we've had the opportunity, obviously, to know the senator for many years by him representing our jurisdiction in the Congress for many years. But for those of you that don't know the senator, which is probably none of you, he is a member of the Health, Education, and Labor Pensions Committee, otherwise known as HELP. He's also on the Foreign Relations Committee and serves on the all-powerful Senate Appropriations Committee. Obviously, before going to the Senate, he was a member of Connecticut's 5th Congressional District for 3 terms. And before that, we all know he was incredibly active in the General Assembly, where he was actually the author of the stem cell investment legislation, and the state's workplace smoking ban. So it is a great honor to have Senator Murphy with us here today. And Senator, I'm going to open the floor to you with your opening comments as to what's going on in Washington, what we can expect, what's the latest legislation that you're facing, and please give us an update as to where we're headed. Thank you for joining us, Senator.
Don, thank you very much for hosting me, Lynn. Great to see you again. Lots of old friends on this call. Really fantastic to join you. I was just thinking, getting ready for this call, it is coming up on 20 years that I've represented the city of Waterbury. I was first a state senator elected to the old Bill Sullivan and Steve Soma seat in the East End, and then of course got the chance to represent Waterbury in the Congress, and now I'm going on my 8th year in the U.S. Senate, and it's just been an absolute joy to work for you all and to learn more every day about how I can fight for you and your businesses and your customers. Let me just give you a very quick update on where we are. I'm going to focus my remarks on COVID and the reopening of Connecticut and the country, and happy to take the conversation wherever you all want to take it. Obviously, this is not the only crisis and big important debate that we're having, but I'll confine my remarks to the COVID-19 epidemic. Listen, first of all, we should be proud of ourselves in Connecticut, and I want to thank the Chamber specifically for doing so much work to get your members and to get businesses in Waterbury ready to reopen safely. And I want to thank you for creating a culture in and around Waterbury, a mask-wearing culture, a culture where people were willing to, go through a really awful, terrible period of sacrifice in order to get to a moment today where Connecticut has the lowest COVID transmission rate of any state in the nation. There are only 3 states in the entire country that are actually on track to fully suppress this virus, and it is Connecticut, New Jersey, and New York, and amongst those, Connecticut has the lowest rate. That doesn't mean we're out of the woods, and it doesn't mean that it isn't super scary that there are states with new outbreaks happening right now, because there's no way for us to completely protect ourselves against the viruses, a virus that's on offense in places that aren't so far from us. But this is a success story, and as we're struggling with how to reopen the right way, we should celebrate that. My job, of course, is to make sure that the resources are there at the federal level to help Connecticut reopen. And I'm certainly proud of the legislation we passed for all of the, well-deserved reputation Congress has as a very broken and partisan place. It is important that we have come together and passed about $4 to $5 trillion worth of new programming, Republicans and Democrats, over the course of this crisis that has frankly kept people and businesses alive. None of it's perfect. You'll give me all sorts of good suggestions on how to modify PPP and how to do the next round of unemployment insurance extension right. But we did it fast, we did it in a bipartisan way, and by and large, it has really helped our economy and helped individuals. So what do we do now? Well, first, I want to talk to you about a proposal that I have. I have been a big supporter of PPP. I would have done it differently if it was me, but it's been important, and we now need the follow-on to PPP. We need the program that's going to help keep businesses alive that are now open, but seeing, for a variety of understandable reasons, a dramatic diminution in revenue. And so I've gotten together with a couple other senators, and we have put together a proposal. We call it the Main Street Emergency Grant Program. And what it does is target, again, temporary relief to businesses that are open, but barely open, and allow that money to be used not just for labor, but for fixed costs as well. I can live with PPP being sort of modified and extended, but I also think it maybe makes sense for us to sort of learn from some of the things that went wrong there and develop a new program. But we need a new business assistance program as we move into the rest of the year, especially in the hospitality space where just public health regulations are going to prevent folks from making any money or even making ends meet when PPP expires. So that is something that I'm leading on because I've heard from many of you. Second, we need a new round of assistance to states and municipalities. The state has gotten money out of the CARES Act, the biggest package we passed. That is only eligible to be used for COVID-related expenses. The state needs federal money in order to just balance its books, because what COVID has done is not just create a whole new category of expenses that we need help for, and that's what the federal government's first infusion of cash is designed to help with, but we also have a cratering of revenues, and we need help from the federal government to backfill our revenue shortfall, because if we don't, that will just be passed along in tax increases to businesses, individuals, a cut in money to the city of Waterbury, which results in property taxes going up. The federal government is the entity that can borrow. The state cannot borrow money to fill deficits. And so it just makes sense for the federal government to be the entity that's helping us in the interim. So we're trying to fight for another round of state and local assistance. Third, I just want to talk about the importance of testing. We're not doing as much of it as we planned in Connecticut. I just want to be honest. We sort of ramped up over the last 2 months from about 3,000 a day to about 5,000, 6,000 a day, but we've plateaued again. And much of the reason is supply. I was just at Mid-State Hospital last week at their drive-through testing facility. One of the reasons they don't do more is because they don't have enough cartridges for their quick turnaround machines. So we need the federal government to temporarily take over the supply chain for testing, something the Trump administration has refused to do. And then we need the president to use the money that we've given him. The last bill gave the president about $14 billion in money to build out more testing sites. He has not deployed that money. I don't know why. I take him at his word, having said a couple times in the last 48 hours that he's going to sort of scale back testing. But we can't safely reopen in Connecticut if we're not testing at least 10,000 people a day. And right now we're only testing about 5,000 people a day. And then finally, Senator McConnell has refused to bring any of this for a vote in the Senate, which is just wild to me. We have so many needs, and I can't understand why we're not having a debate. What McConnell has said is that he wants liability protections for businesses to be a part of that discussion. I'm game. I think that's a really important conversation to have. Obviously, there's probably a whole bunch of different ways that you can create liability protections for lawsuits from businesses but count me in for that conversation. Maybe I don't want to go as far as McConnell wants to go, but I certainly understand why you need to have that conversation, why you want to give folks an expectation that if they comply with all the guidance that they're getting from the state or the federal government, that they're not going to be subject to frivolous lawsuits. That to me is not an excuse for why we're not debating the bill. I'm a progressive Democrat, but I want to have that conversation, but I want to have it in the context of all these other things that we need to do to make sure that we can continue to reopen and reopen safely. So I will sort of stop there. There's a million other things that we can talk about, but lastly, let me just say, any way that my office can help you. Obviously, we're sponges for policy advice right now, to hear your priorities about how to amend existing programs and what new programs we need stood up. But I also have a team that's there to help your workers, your customers, your neighbors with a host of issues you may be having with the federal government right now. My team is working 24/7. As you know, the director of my office is Kenny Curran, a Waterbury guy, and whether it's a problem with PPP, whether it's a problem with unemployment compensation, whether it's a problem with immigration or passports, we're there. And so just make sure that sort of everybody in your universe knows that it's not just that you can contact us with sort of policy advice and priorities for legislation. We're also there to do casework as well. So I will stop there and open this up to the conversation.
Thank you, Senator. And with that in mind, I would just like to make sure that our viewers know they can submit questions via the chat option as we go. We do have some questions that were submitted before today's event. But it's on a side note, Senator, I was driving back from the office today to my house to get ready for today, and I just kept thinking about how you were kind of famous for your door knocking when you started your elections back in the day, going all around to door knocking and shaking hands. And imagine today trying to do anything like, it shows you how the times have changed. You can't even go shake someone's hand in your jurisdiction now to try to win them over for an election. It just made me think about how times have changed, but I remember those days. But Senator, I'll get right into the questions if you don't mind. The first question we have, Senator, submitted is, do you believe it is too soon to allow certain businesses to reopen? Why or why not?
So I talk with Governor Lamont and his team fairly regularly, but I am not in the room with his reopening committee, and thus I'll just be honest with you, I don't necessarily have a granular opinion in Connecticut about which businesses should reopen and which shouldn't. I have largely given advice to the governor. I've consulted with him, but I haven't second guessed the decisions that he has made and his team have made. What I appreciate about Governor Lamont is that he has been open to changing his mind. He got some grief when he, postponed the opening of salons, but that's what a good leader should do. They should make decisions, and then if they receive additional input or data that contradicts the decision that they have made previously, they should amend it. And I also think, and I've said this to the governor a number of times. I was with him at his house a couple weeks ago, a week and a half ago, having this conversation with him. I think he's got to be prepared to pull back if we start to see outbreaks, and in particular when it comes to the opening of schools. I've got 2 elementary school age public school kids. I want schools to reopen. I don't see how our economy works if schools don't reopen. At the same time, the governor's going to have to let data guide him. And if we reopen schools and then we see an outbreak in a certain part of Connecticut, we're going to have to jump on that. And it may be that we don't have statewide closures. It may be that there are certain parts of Connecticut where the schools sort of close back up and engage in distance learning. That's why we need more testing than we have right now, because it's really hard to get geographic specific data when we're only doing 3,000 tests or 5,000 tests a day. That's where we need to do a lot more. So I don't mean to sort of, cop out of answering the question. I just sort of haven't. I think it's important for me not to sort of come up with my own list separate and aside from the governor as to what businesses should open and what shouldn't. I support his decisions and am working to implement them.
Fair enough. Thank you, Senator. I don't know if you saw the news today, but the governor came out with some, basically there's a new self-quarantine ban out where if you're going down to certain states down south, Florida, North Carolina, a number of other states where you've got to self-quarantine now for 14 days when you come back because of the spikes in those states. So it's obviously a very fluid situation.
Well, just think about how fast this has changed. You know, I haven't flown back and forth to DC in months. I drive back and forth. And, you know, it used to be that as I was driving south from Connecticut, the highway signs would tell me that if you are coming to Maryland from Connecticut, New York, or New Jersey, you have to quarantine for 14 days. Now the signs tell me as I'm going north, as I enter New Jersey, if you're coming from Maryland or Virginia or North Carolina, you have to quarantine. It's just a sign of how, frankly, state policies do matter. And again, an advertisement for the good work that we've done in Connecticut.
Indeed. Next, Senator, next question. Will there be another stimulus bill? And if so, what do you expect it to include?
So there has to be another one. We're facing a number of cliffs here. As I mentioned, you've got the PPP cliff. You have the unemployment compensation cliff. And then you've got the rent cliff, right? Which maybe not enough people are talking about. You know, people have not had to pay their rent for 3 months, but there's a portion at which they not only have to pay it, but they have to pay it going backwards. So people were sort of surprised that unemployment didn't move from sort of 13, 14%. Well, that is largely because of PPP and the programs, the other programs I mentioned. You will have a humanitarian catastrophe in this country if unemployment goes back to regular levels, PPP goes away, and rent has to be paid, and there's no way to stop millions of evictions all across the country. So we've got to put together some package that helps keep people whole, and that is probably additional unemployment benefits, maybe not as big as they were in the previous round. It probably means some rental assistance package. I don't think you can just withhold rent for another 3 months, but you probably have to get some money into the hands of renters to help them make their payments. And then, as I mentioned, it's some kind of extension to the PPP program in some way, shape, or form. And then lastly, some assistance to states. We're just not out of this. And I mean, it feels much better in Connecticut, but as you know, paying attention to the news, other parts of the country are literally entering the crisis. And the problem, and here's the real problem. I don't know what, maybe it's for political and ideological reasons, but these places like Florida and Arizona, they are not going to close their businesses down. I mean, they sort of made it clear. And so if you're not willing to close your businesses down, then there's no real way to stop the spread of the virus. And so that once again speaks to a federal government taking a little firmer, putting a little firmer hand on closure policy, because I asked the rest of the country to help Connecticut when we were at our peak, but that was because we were doing all the right things to get our numbers down. It's a little different to ask the rest of the country to help out Arizona or Texas if virus numbers are spiraling out of control and they refuse to do anything about it. So we're going to have to get to some consistency, and maybe another legislative package can help paint the pathway to get there. Thank
you, Senator. We have some questions coming in from the participants. I'll go back and forth between the pre-submitted and the participants. And this one comes in, will we start border checks like there were in Florida just weeks ago?
I don't know the answer to that question. I'm not terribly interested in shutting down our state borders to each other. I think what we have seen is that these quarantines that have been enforced without state borders being closed have worked. What we know is that if states engage in the set of policies that Connecticut did, and Connecticut didn't close our borders, we didn't check people on 95 or 84. We were able to get this virus largely under control by simply changing our own state policies for a period of time. And so I think that given the fact we have enough experience to know what works, we don't probably need to engage in those kind of draconian practices that ultimately could slow the nation's economy down to a point where unemployment numbers start spiraling again.
Makes sense. Thank you, Senator. Go back to the submitted questions. Businesses are asking for protection, and you touched on this earlier, by the way, Senator, this question. Businesses are asking for protection from liability as the economy reopens to protect both against COVID-19 lawsuits and customers' clients, as well as protect from COVID-19 related workers' compensation claims. Do you expect Congress to consider protections for businesses that are in good faith that would support them, and why not?
Yeah, I mentioned this outside. I do. I mean, I do think we should take a look at this issue. And, obviously we're dealing in a lot of guesswork here about what the liability is and what the potential level of lawsuit may be. And I do believe sometimes we overinflate the danger of prospective liability. And so I don't want to overprotect ourselves here. And I also, don't want to give businesses too much immunity, because if you aren't complying willfully or negligently with the guidance you've been given, then I don't know that we want to provide a complete and total cover. But it does make sense to me, as I said at the outset, that if you are making a good faith effort to comply with guidance, then you should expect to, not be on the hook for frivolous lawsuits. And so I just count me as someone who wants to be part of that conversation. Part of what's been frustrating is that Senator McConnell talks about this being a bottom line, but we don't have a proposal. He hasn't introduced any language that would allow us to start, having a more detailed and nuanced debate. But I certainly am interested in having that conversation.
Sure. I mean, it makes sense. If you have a flagrant disregard for the protections that are put in place, then obviously you put yourself to be more susceptible to potential suits. So it makes perfect sense, Senator. So our next question, Senator, in the first rounds of relief provided by Congress, 501c6 organizations, including many chambers of commerce, were not eligible to apply. Chambers have proven to be invaluable in providing businesses with information about the various relief programs, as well as information on where to find personal protective equipment and other items to protect their workers and customers and clients. Would you support making chambers and other 501c6 organizations eligible for future relief programs? And I know this gets into the whole issue, this is not on the question, but obviously with the lobbyists, that's why there was the hiccup there and everything else with those organizations. But please share your thoughts on that.
So I just think we should cast as wide a net when it comes to PPP as possible. I don't actually, I did not support singling out any sort of entities based on tax status. And as you mentioned, it was really done for political reasons. Nobody wanted chambers of commerce not to be able to get a PPP loan, but because chambers of commerce are in this sort of same category of a lot of political organizations that are, very much involved in the political debate, there was a decision made to not allow for PPP loans to be made to political organizations because, it certainly would be ripe for, evening cable news show criticism. But the bottom line is, I think that was a mistake. I think that if there are lumps to be taken there, we should take them, and we should just not pick winners and losers here. If you're a business or if you're not for profit, you should be eligible for a PPP loan based upon whether you qualify, not based upon your tax status. And that's been my position. It has not won the day. So I do not have enough support for that. I don't know whether that change will be included in any subsequent legislation, but it's certainly my belief.
Thank you, Senator. I got another question from one of our participants. The arts and entertainment industry has been devastated. The Actors Union is advocating for a continuation of the unemployment stimulus for artists and performers. What are the prospects of that happening?
I don't think that there's going to be an industry-specific approach to unemployment compensation. So I think that's the bottom line answer to that question. But the premise is right. The arts business has been devastated and will, frankly, continue to hemorrhage for months, if not years. Remember, no matter what government decides in terms of whether a restaurant or a theater can open, it is ultimately up to customers as to whether they come back. And if you read the the national polls, folks are not ready, to sort of live life the way that they used to, which means they're probably not ready to fill the seats at the Warner or at the Palace in the way that they did years ago. So that, to me, merits making sure we have an ongoing system of subsidies for at least the rest of the year for industries like the hospitality and arts and entertainment industry that have seen a serious drop off in revenue. I don't think, though, that we will take that approach to unemployment benefits, because if you're out of work, you're out of work. And I don't know that we would choose to give a longer or increased benefit to somebody who lost their job in one industry versus another industry, given that the effect on you and your family is the same.
Yeah, Senator, I've been doing my rounds, seeing what's out there, who's been pulling in business. And I think what's important to a lot of our members is that just because the restrictions have been relaxed doesn't mean that their money is coming back in, because it's not. I mean, you go to some of these restaurants, even though it's 50% capacity, they're probably at like 10 or 15% capacity. You go to the gyms, they're maybe at 5 to 10% capacity. That's because people are being careful. But I think if we just set deadlines and say, well, we've eased on the restrictions, you should be making more money. That's not the case. So we have to have I think a longer term view as to what it's going to take for these businesses to recover, just based on people being careful. That's just.
Well, and listen, and that's an expensive endeavor. And so the question will be, is it a worthwhile expensive endeavor? And in my mind, it is, for a number of reasons, but I'll just give you one that's at the top of my mind as you're dealing with this, but this is a mass extinction event for small businesses. And it is a potential mass extinction event in particular for restaurants. And it comes at a moment where we're living through a mass extinction of small businesses and startups, right? Startups are at an all-time historical low in the United States today. We celebrate the ones that succeed, but the reality is that we have far fewer today than we did 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And the reason for that is that there are these mega businesses that are just crowding out space for Main Street businesses. And so part of the reason why the stock market was humming along was because investors were making a bet that this was actually going to be really good for blue chip stocks, because the Amazons and the Walmarts and the CVSs were just going to gobble up all of the lost business of smaller and medium-sized businesses that disappear in this crisis. And to my mind, that's not good for this country. That's not good for our economy. I mean, I shop at Amazon, I shop at CVS, they're not the evil empire, but I want choice. And I want the businesses that have made Waterbury to be around for generations. And so, yes, it is expensive, to think about spending another $2 trillion to support small businesses in 2020 and 2021. But in a 20-year time horizon, I just think you can make the case that if that's what keeps those businesses alive for the long run, that's probably a worthwhile investment in all of us. And so that's the debate that we're going to have. And I'm just sort of previewing, where I come down.
Thank you, Senator. Very well stated, by the way. Next question. It's likely the impact of COVID-19's pandemic will extend well past the IRS tax filing extension date of July 15th. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has proposed extending the existing filing and payment relief, ideally until April 15, 2021, but at a minimum, October 15, 2020. Additionally, the Chamber urges that this payment and filing relief be extended to additional taxes, such as excise taxes, that have immediate liquidity impacts. Do you support these proposals?
Yeah, I'd have to take a look at them. I did support very loudly the proposal to push off the deadline past April, and I actually think I was one of the first members of the Senate to push the IRS on that. I'd have to think a little bit more about that. I'd have to take a look at the numbers. Obviously we're weighing here. We're weighing between a legitimate case being made by businesses that they're not in a position to pay versus a legitimate need on behalf of the federal government and state governments to fund services. And state governments tend to follow the lead of the federal government on tax filing deadlines. It's hard for them not to. And from a state perspective, it's really hard to postpone revenue because, again, they can't borrow, well, they can't print money like the federal government can print money. So I'd have to think a little bit about that before I commit to it, but I hear the case.
Thank you, Senator. We appreciate your, at least look into it. We'd love to hear back from you on that. Next question. The U.S. Chamber also notes that as approved, federal tax relief applies to only calendar year taxpayers. The Chamber proposes that subsequent tax relief be applicable to both calendar and fiscal year taxpayers. What's your thoughts on that?
Don't have any. I'll take it.
Yeah.
That's first impression. That's a first impression question. So I'll be happy to.
Yeah, that's pretty specific. So we'll
take it I'll be happy to take it for the record.
Got it. Thank you, Senator. Next question. Do you think Congress should approve a financial relief package for states facing depression-level unemployment levels and vastly reduced tax revenues? And how do you respond to those that say relief should not be provided that states that do not have their fiscal houses in order?
Well, listen, Connecticut balances its budget every year, very different than the federal government. And so, when I hear people saying that, Connecticut doesn't have its fiscal house in order, well, we balance our budget every year. And yeah, I mean, we have challenges, but they aren't, they're just different challenges than other states have. So, somebody in Florida can tell me that the state of Connecticut doesn't have its fiscal house in order because you pay your state employees more in retirement benefits than we do. Well, I can tell you that you don't have your house in order because you have kids failing out of 5th grade at a rate that is twice that of Connecticut. So, we all have our, crosses to bear. So I don't get into this game of, the states that deserve money and the states that don't deserve money. And what I've said to my friends who, sometimes toe this line, and Mitch McConnell was one of them, who said, why should we help states like Connecticut or New York that don't have their fiscal house in order? Well, every single year, Connecticut taxpayers send billions of dollars to Kentucky. Outside of Virginia and Maryland, Kentucky is the second biggest net gainer in terms of federal revenues, money they put in and money they take out. So what I say to all my friends who say, well, we don't want to help Connecticut out during this time is, okay, if you want to have a conversation about making sure that no state subsidizes any other state, sign me up. I will have that conversation because if that's the deal moving forward, then Florida will not be able to fund its Medicaid program because you're funding your Medicaid program based upon tax receipts, largely through income tax receipts from places like Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey. So I think we won that argument pretty quickly. It was kind of, it was out there in the ether for a couple of weeks, but I think pretty quickly the senators who tended to be from net gain federal revenue states realized they didn't want to get into that conversation with states like New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut.
Thank you, Senator. And I know we're pushing you on time. We're already actually beyond your allotted time, but I'll ask you one more question before we wrap up. And thank you so much again. Do you think Connecticut will support the Apple/Android COVID tracing tool? And if so, what's the plan to educate the public on how it works and why we should sign up for it?
So I got this question last night for the first time on a conference call, and I pledged last night to look into it, and I got busy with a million things today, and so I didn't. We are obviously developing an app in Connecticut so that everyone in the state can be on a common platform for the purposes of tracing. And I have to get the answer to the question, but my belief is that some of the changes that are being made on people's smartphones are to be able to handle this app, but I will double check on that. I do think it's really important that we all be on a common software in order to track this disease, meaning that if you get it, it's just best to be able to notify people via the same app that everybody else is using. And my hope is that people would be willing to share that information with the state. And I think we're working out the details of it as we speak. I know people are going to be a little freaked out about the government sort of knowing whether you have COVID or not and know who you've been in contact with. But if we're really serious about getting rid of this and stamping it out for good, then we do have to have a little bit of faith in the public sector to take that information and do the right things by it. So I don't know the details of how our software intersects with the stuff that Android and Apple are doing. But I do think that we're going to have some faith in this universal platform that the state is developing and use it in the case that we get infected and have to notify our friends and family, because that information ultimately aggregated helps us attack the disease from a macro level.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's in a very early stages as far as what actually is included. You know, how obviously it's a voluntary app to begin with, so you're giving your information voluntarily, and then you're spreading with people that you at least know, and that's the idea, is to say, hey guys, think here's where I've been, here's where somebody was positive. So I guess it's a little early in the stage for everyone to really know exactly what's involved with it. So we all have to learn more about that, along with yourself as well, Senator. We look forward to that. Well, Senator, we have taken up a good deal of your time already today. I just want to thank you again on behalf of the Waterbury Regional Chamber for your time. We know how incredibly busy you are down there and up here in Connecticut. So thank you so much again for being here. I'll turn over to Lynn for her closing remarks. Thank you again, Senator.
Thanks. Appreciate it, Don.
Lynn, I think you're muted over there.
Sorry about that. I'd like to thank the Senator on behalf of our Waterbury Regional Chamber. As our Chairman, Don McPartland, just mentioned, we appreciate your time. We do know that when we have an issue on behalf of any of our chamber members, we reach out to your office, and your office is very responsive, and your leadership has been very helpful to our business community. So we thank you for that and look forward to continuing to work with you. Again, I want to thank Carmody, Torrance, Sandeck, and Hennessy for sponsoring our briefing today with Senator Murphy. And as we always do, our doors are open for businesses in the greater Waterbury region to reach out to us. We're here to help you, and we're certainly here to welcome you as members of our chamber. So thank you all to our members who joined us this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you again. And of course, waterburychamber.com has all of our upcoming events, COVID information, and all sorts of business resources for you. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Lynn. Thanks, Don. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Senator.